shot began, not with a jolt, but with a glacial, almost imperceptible drift. It was a high-definition, slow-motion crawl down an infinite airport hallway, a descent into a liminal space designed to be traversed, never truly inhabited. Carpet beneath the unseen camera was a nauseating geometric pattern, a kaleidoscope of bruised purple and nicotine yellow that seemed to undulate with a slow, internal rhythm. Every pixel was excruciatingly rendered, making the artificiality of the pattern a source of profound, realistic unease. It wasn't just a design. It was a shadow loom weaving patterns of disquiet into the subconscious. The walls rose on either side, sterile white expanses that stretched upwards into impossibly high, ribcage-like arches. They gleamed under an unforgiving, clinical white light that flickered at a precise, unsettling 60 Hz frequency. This wasn't merely illumination. It was an exposed dissection, stripping the scene of any warmth or natural shadow. The light itself felt dramatic, a perpetual interrogation that left no surface unexamined, no imperfection unrevealed. The air, though unseen, felt thick with the sensation of ozone and industrial-grade bleach, a metallic tang that spoke of perpetual disinfection. The only sound breaking the eerie silence was a heavy, electric hum, a pervasive, low-frequency drone that vibrated through the floor and seemed to settle in the viewer's chest. It was the heartbeat of an impossibly vast machine, a mechanical metamorphosis of architectural space into a living, breathing entity. The hum wasn't just audible. It was a sensation, a pressure behind the eyes, a subtle tremor in the bones. It was the sound of a system that functioned perfectly, but for a purpose utterly alien to human understanding. In the distance, the first signs of activity emerged. Featureless staff in bright navy uniforms glided down the hallway. Their movements were not fluid, but jerky, frame-skipped, reminiscent of a corrupted video file playing in slow motion. Each step was a subtle, unsettling pop of articulated joints, a viral horror ballet of mechanical grace. Their faces were smooth, unblemished expanses of skin-tone wax, utterly devoid of eyes, mouths, or noses, a disturbing testament to the uncanny valley. Designed to mimic humanity just enough to breed profound revulsion, they pushed luggage carts, their wheels groaning against the pristine carpet, laden with suitcases that seemed to possess an unnatural weight. The camera continued its slow, inexorable journey. The hallway stretched ahead, an endless vista of repeating arches and geometric patterns, promising no destination and offering no escape. The sense of claustrophobia didn't come from a lack of space, but from the horrifying realization of its boundlessness. It was the feeling of being trapped in an infinite loop, a predetermined path that had no end. Every distant feature receded at the exact rate the camera advanced, maintaining an eternal, unyielding perspective. As the camera passed one of the gliding staff, a subtle shift occurred. The entity's blank head swiveled, not toward the camera, but past it, as if tracking an invisible anomaly. The flicker of the 60 Hz lights seemed to catch in the staff member's waxy skin, making it ripple with a transient, oily sheen. A faint, almost imperceptible sound emanated from the entity, a whispered sensation that was instantly swallowed by the omnipresent hum. It sounded like a fragment of a memory, a single, distorted syllable of a forgotten name. The camera began to focus on the carpet. Bruised purple and nicotine yellow patterns, once merely nauseating, now appeared to writhe. Subtle, vein-like lines, barely visible beneath the surface, pulsed with a faint internal light. It was as if the carpet itself was a living membrane, a shadow loom that absorbed and processed the unseen energies of this terminal. The repeating geometric patterns seemed to expand and contract, breathing in time with the electric hum, drawing the viewer deeper into its hypnotic, lynching grasp. Up ahead, a series of identical digital display boards flickered into view. They didn't show flight numbers or gates. Instead, they displayed dates: October 27, 1998, May 12, 2005, July 14, 2024, and next to each date, in stark red letters, was the unchanging status, delayed indefinitely. This wasn't an airport for travel. It was an archive of stalled timelines, a purgatory for temporal displacement. Camera's tracking speed remained constant, yet the sense of distance began to compress. The featureless staff seemed to multiply, their jerky movements filling the hallway as far as the eye could see, gliding with a silent, relentless purpose. Their uniformity was terrifying, an uncanny valley legion moving in perfect, synchronized anonymity. Each one was a shadow of a person, a shell emptied of identity died as the camera continued its slow, inexorable journey. A new phenomenon emerged on the pristine white walls. Faint, ghostly outlines, barely perceptible, began to appear. They were humanoid but indistinct, like chalk drawings erased countless times. They were the residuals, the shadows of those who had passed through this terminal, their essences absorbed by the architecture. And in the very far distance, at the absolute end of the infinite hallway, a single, gigantic digital display board pulsed with a blinding, purple light. On its screen, a single, unblinking eye stared back at the camera. The electric hum intensified, vibrating with a revenge against the silence, pulling the viewer closer, ever closer, into the chilling embrace of the terminal's true nature. Camera's relentless glide forward remained unbroken, but the sensation of movement began to feel like a deception. The high-definition tracking shot, once a journey through space, was now a descent through a biological archive. The nausea induced by the bruised, purple and nicotine yellow carpet intensified as the geometric patterns began to shift from abstract designs into recognizable, though distorted, human features. In the slow-motion sweep of the lens, the patterns resolved into thousands of tiny, screaming mouths frozen in the weave of the fabric. They didn't make a sound. They were merely exposed as textures in the architecture of the terminal. The sterility of the white walls was being compromised. The metamorphosis of the environment was subtle but realistic, where the 60 Hz flicker hit the plaster. Then, translucent filaments resembling the hair-like nerves of a deep-sea creature began to sprout from the seams of the arches. These filaments swayed in an unseen current, rhythmically pulsing in time with the heavy electric hum. The trauma of the space was becoming visible, a physical manifestation of a system that had been harvesting the biological data of its travelers. For centuries, the featureless staff were no longer just distant figures. The camera was now closing the gap, moving with a surgical precision alongside a gliding navy blue uniform. At this proximity, the uncanny valley was no longer a theory but a visceral sensation. The waxy skin of the staff member didn't just look artificial. It looked translucent beneath the surface. The flickering light revealed a complex network of copper wiring and pulsating purple ichor. There were no organs, no bones, only the shadow loom of a mechanical imitation. The jerky, frame-skipped movements were revealed to be the result of the entity resetting its physical position every few seconds, as if it were struggling to remain rendered in three-dimensional space. The electric hum began to modulate, layering itself with the shadows of voices. It wasn't speech, but the frequency of speech, the rhythmic cadence of a mother's lullaby, the sharp staccato of an argument, the low murmur of a prayer. Terminal Zero was a memory harvest. The hum was the sound of those memories being ground into jet fuel. The claustrophobia was no longer a product of the hallway's length, but of the exposed truth that every traveler who stepped onto this carpet became a part of its permanent inventory. Camera panned slightly toward one of the security kiosks. It was a monolith of molded, gray plastic that seemed to have grown out of the floor like a tumor. Behind the glass sat another staff member, its featureless head tilted at an impossible, multi-jointed angle. On its desk sat a stack of passports. As the camera glided past, a single passport fell open. It didn't contain a photo or a name. It contained a live feed of a child's birthday party, the colors vibrant and realistic, playing in a silent, agonizing loop. The revenge of the terminal was to turn a life into a sensation that could be filed and forgotten. The lighting shifted. The clinical white began to bleed into a bruised violet. The 60 Hz flicker slowing down until the intervals of darkness were as long as the intervals of light. In these gaps of shadow, the residuals on the walls became solid. For a fraction of a second, the camera captured a man in a tailored suit, his face a mask of frantic, sweating concentration clawing at the sterile white paint. When the light returned, he was gone, replaced by a fresh, geometric pattern on the carpet. The metamorphosis was a constant recalibration of matter ahead. The baggage handling system became audible not as a mechanical clatter, but as a rhythmic thumping, like a second heart beating in the belly of the architecture. Thump thump, thump thump. Tracking shot moved toward a set of silver-toothed conveyor belts that emerged from the wall. They weren't carrying suitcases. They were carrying organs made of leather and memories made of brass. A violin that bled, a wedding ring that screamed, a childhood toy that breathed with a wet, ragged intake of air. Camera was now approaching the giant digital display at the end of the hall, the one with the unblinking eye. The eye was no longer a static image. It was biological. The iris was a mosaic of 1,000,000 different human eyes, all blinking in a chaotic, unsynchronized sensation. The shadows of the staff members began to detach from their feet, sliding across the nicotine yellow carpet to form a darkness that pooled at the base of the screen. The electricom reached a seismic pitch, vibrating the camera lens until the high-definition clarity began to fray into analog static. The sensation of being swallowed was absolute. The hallway wasn't just a path, it was a throat. As the camera prepared to cross the threshold into the dark beneath the giant eye, a new status appeared on the display boards, flickering in time with the lens's vibration. Final boarding, all residents. The camera's glide accelerated, the slow-motion tracking turning into a violent, frame-skipped rush toward the eye, which snapped open wider than humanly possible, revealing a void where the iris should be, asterisk. The transition into the void was not an exit, but a deeper integration. Camera, now moving with a violent, frame-skipped urgency, found itself back in the same hallway or a shadow version of it. The color palette had inverted. Bruised purple was now a raw, inflamed magenta, and the nicotine yellow had turned into the color of aged bone. The nauseating geometric patterns on the carpet were no longer mere textures. They had become three-dimensional. Thousands of tiny, waxy hands reached up from the fabric, their digits brushing against the unseen lens with a realistic wetness. The sensation was one of being pulled down into the very foundation of the terminal's memory, the clinical 60 Hz. Flicker had evolved into a strobe effect that exposed the structural metamorphosis of the arches. They were no longer white plaster but calcified bone, their ribcage-like appearance now literal. Between the ribs, the walls were lined with a translucent, vein-streaked membrane that throbbed in perfect synchronization with the heavy electric hum. This was the maternal source of the terminal, a biological engine that converted trauma into the architecture of the infinite. Camera's high-definition clarity now captured the sensation of the walls sweating a thick, amber-colored resin, which trapped the shadows of travelers in mid-screen. The staff had also undergone a transformation. The navy uniforms were now fused to their waxy skin, the fabric becoming a leathery epidermis. They no longer glided. They moved with a frantic, multi-jointed sensation, their telescoping limbs extending to adjust arrival departure screens that were now embedded directly into the wall's flesh. Their featureless faces had cracked open, revealing CRT monitors that played grainy, black and white footage of the Millers of Arthur, belies every manifestation that had ever been processed by the system. The viral horror was the realization that the terminal was a collective archive of every replacement ever made. The electric hum was now a chorus of 1,000 different pitches, a layered tapestry of shadow self-confessions. It wasn't just noise. It was a surgical extraction of the soul. Camera glided past the janitor who was mopping the nicotine yellow floor with a liquid that looked like liquid static. As the mop moved, it didn't clean. It erased. It removed the realistic history of the floorboards, replacing them with a void of non-existence. The revenge of the architecture was its ability to make the world obsolete. The baggage handling system was now visible as a series of vertical throats in the floor. The conveyor belts were made of human hair, woven into a shadow loom that transported biological relics toward the core. Camera looked down into one of these pits and saw the pilot. He wasn't standing at a board. He was fused into the machinery. His waxy skin stretched thin across a series of hydraulic pistons. His arrival-departure eyes were spinning so fast they had become a blur of violet light, announcing the departure of every individual thought Elias or Arthur had ever possessed. The claustrophobia was now a structural reality. The ribcage arches were closing in, the distance between the floor and the ceiling shrinking as the biomass of the terminal swelled. Camera felt the pressure against its imaginary frame, the sensation of being squeezed through a digestive tract. The exposed truth was that Terminal Zero wasn't an airport for planes. It was a filter for existence. It stripped the noise of life away until only the silent geometry of the square remained. The giant digital display at the end of the hall had changed. The unblinking eye had been replaced by a blueprint. It It was a diagram of the human heart, but the chambers had been replaced by a 10 by 10 grid of rooms. The shadows of the staff were flowing into this blueprint, filling the rooms with the ichor of the traveler's memories. The metamorphosis was a return to the original caged iron reinforced wood of the ancestors. As the camera reached the final gate, the lighting turned an absolute Cimmerian black. The 60 Hz flicker died, replaced by a single, pulsing red light that emanated from the baggage throats in this new shadow loom. Camera saw its own reflection for the first time in the silver-toothed conveyor belts. It wasn't a camera. It was a replacement, a man in a navy blue uniform, his face a smooth expanse of wax, his eyes flickering with the grainy footage. The family he no longer remembered. The electricom reached a seismic frequency that shattered the high-definition image into 1,000,000 shards of analog static. The sensation of the floor turning into skin was the last thing exposed before the void claimed the lens, but through the static, a new signal began to emerge. The voice distorted, layered, yet unmistakably familiar whispered through the vents of the terminal. "Check your pockets. Elias, you still have the ticket to the true room." Camera reset to the beginning of the hallway, but this time the staff were all looking directly into the lens, and they were all smiling a jagged vertical tear. The reset was not a return to the beginning, but a completion of the circle. Camera, now a replacement with waxy skin and frame-skipped reflexes, found itself at the head of the infinite hallway once more, but the realistic world had been completely purged. The bruised purple and nicotine yellow of the carpet had become a living topography, a shadow loom of human epidermis that rippled with the sensation of 1,000 feet. The sterile white walls were gone, replaced by the exposed inner lining of a gargantuan throat, ribcage arches now glistening with a wet, translucent mucus that tasted of copper and ancient dust. The staff were no longer gliders. They were the architecture. They stood in perfectly spaced intervals, their multi-jointed limbs fused into the bone arches, their navy uniforms now a part of the house's internal membrane. As the camera moved forward, their CRT monitor faces flickered in a synchronized 60 Hz pulse, broadcasting the final memory harvest. Every screen showed the same image, a 10 by 10 square of charred, blackened dirt. The trauma of every starry Elias Arthur. The Miller family had been compressed into this single, geometric scar. The heavy electric hum had reached its final frequency, vibration that transcended sound and became a metamorphosis of gravity. The claustrophobia was absolute. The throat was closing. Camera's sensation of self was dissolving into the metabolism of the corridor. It could feel the subfloor root system drawing the dark fluid of its identity down into the maternal source. There was no more pilot, no more janitor, and no more replacement. There was only the terminal, and the terminal was a stomach. The camera approached the final gate, which was no longer a display board but a jagged, vertical tear in the fabric of reality itself. Through the tear, the void beckoned not as a place of non-existence, but as the true room. It was the windowless core of the architecture, the place where the ancestors had lured the hunger before geometry was born. The sensation was one of a terrifying, homecoming revenge. The terminal wasn't an airport. It was the mouth of the Vance estate, and the infinite hallway was its esophagus. The 60 Hz flicker slowed to a crawl, capturing the stop-motion horror of the final integration. Camera saw the blueprint one last time. It was no longer a diagram. It was a skin map of the viewer's own soul. Every wrong turn, every secret, and every trauma had been used to calculate the exact dimensions of the 10 by 10 cell. Waiting at the end of the hall, the revenge of the terminal was that it didn't just capture you. It became you. The camera crossed the threshold of the vertical tier. The high-definition world vanished. The cinematic lighting died. There was only the grainy black and white static of the internal monitor. Camera looked back and saw the hallway folding inward, the bone arches snapping like dry tinder as the terminal contracted into its final form. The staff, the navy uniforms, and the waxy skin were all pulled into the void, compressed into a single, pulsing mound of translucent, vein-streaked flesh in the absolute silence that followed the hum. A single sensation remained, a wet, rhythmic intake of air. Inhale, pause, exhale. It wasn't coming from the room. It was coming from the blueprint itself. The camera, now a single, unblinking eye clouded with a milky cataract, looked down. It saw a 10 by 10 space of warm, living skin. It saw a heavy, grease-stained tube of vellum blueprints lying on the floor. As the shadow loom of the terminal finally went dark, a new replacement stepped into the center of the square. The cycle was stabilized. The signal was permanent. Inside the viewer's own ribs, a 10 by 10 space began to open. The floor beneath their feet began to liquefy. The viral horror had reached its final destination. The instructions for my replacement had been followed to the letter. Terminal 0 was now arrived. The screen of the world flickered one last time, displaying a single jagged vertical smile. "We finished the room for you."